Okay, welcome. The third topic on Chapter 8 on assessing, monitoring and labeling poultry welfare is on how to aggregate animal welfare indicators in order to develop monitoring protocols. In the Best Practice Hens project, a decision tree was developed for choosing an appropriate hen welfare monitoring tool, because many tools have been developed already in various countries, but often with different types of emphasis or different types of applications in mind. So the starting point of the decision tree is it important when you use the monitoring tool that you can benchmark with other farms? So do you want to compare one farm to other farms? And that can immediately exclude some protocols and include other protocols that allow that feature. The second big decision is, are you prepared in the assessment to handle individual animals, to actually pick up and assess the state of an animal, or do you only want to do observations from a distance? That is again decides which protocols are suitable for your purpose. Another aspect in the decision tree could be, do you want to also include farms where the animals have an outdoor? And do you want to include that aspect in the assessment? The answer could be yes or no. And then you get a list of possible protocols that are available according to your requirements. And some of the protocols that are primarily meant for the farmer to be used in order for the farmer to do a kind of an assessment of the welfare of his own animals on his own farm. Other protocols are mainly meant for an auditor or a trained person to do the assessment. In the Best Practice Hens project, also a welfare assessment tool has been developed and is freely available on that web link if you want to see. It's a tool that is meant to be very time efficient, in which transect lines are being walked, during which observations are being done. And I already talked about the welfare quality protocol in the previous lecture on welfare indicators, which takes at least a half a day on a farm to do an assessment. So let's talk a little bit more about how in the welfare quality protocol different indicators are aggregated and why they do this. So because in the welfare quality protocol, there is a three-step integration procedure. You start off with the information, your raw data on the welfare indicators. That gives you measured data. You need to be integrated to criterion scores. These are scores from 1 to 100 for each of the 12 animal welfare criteria. These are then translated into principal scores, also from 0 to 100, before then an overall animal welfare categorization is given, an overall welfare assessment. Why these different steps in welfare quality? Is because different levels of integration are needed depending on the user or the application. It doesn't help a farmer to say the overall welfare status on your farm is such or so. It gives the farmer much more information if you give him information about specific indicators and scores for each of the 12 criteria. That will be much more informative for a farmer for taking the correct actions in order to try to improve that aspect of welfare. However, if we want to do or use the welfare assessments to label food products in order to inform the consumer about the animal welfare status of the food he's buying, then the consumer will never read all that information. He will need a very concise overall assessment of the welfare. And so that's why the different levels of aggregation can be very useful. In the first step of integration, here in the light green, welfare quality made mainly use of experts rather than lay people, because you need a lot of domain knowledge to translate the information from the measurements to the welfare criterion. Whereas if you go towards the last step of integration, where you get scores for feeding, housing, health, and appropriate behavior from 0 to 100, and you have to say, like, how would you summarize that in an overall welfare score? Then you don't need to have so much domain knowledge, but it mainly comes down to kind of your ethical view or your philosophical view of these things. And so towards the latter steps of integration, also layman people are included in doing this weighing of the one principle compared to the other principle. Another aspect that is included in the welfare quality aggregation methodology is that the amount of compensation is limited, especially towards the end of the integration steps. The reasoning is, or what is meant with it, is that the overall welfare is rarely the average of the scores, but will be more biased towards the bad scores. Is because if you suffer from a certain health problem, the welfare is discriminated. And it can't be compensated by having good scores on other aspects. If an animal, for example, is severely lame, it will suffer. And it will suffer severely, even if its body condition is still okay. Yeah. So that's a bit the idea of the welfare quality. You need to do on-farm welfare monitoring that gives information that needs to go or could go to informing the consumer via labeling, or it could go to the farmer in order to take decisions on the management and the housing in order to change these as risk factors for animal welfare. So the last step of the integration in welfare quality, you get a result from 0 to 100 for these 4 welfare principles. And a farm could have a good score for feeding, a lower score for housing, a good score for health, and again a lower score for behavior. Then the question is, what shall we give that as an overall welfare category? And it could be excellent, enhanced, acceptable, or not classified. This farm will probably be enhanced, because the decision rules they use are simple rules, like in order to receive the category excellent, you need to have a score of over 55 on all 4 principles, and you need a score of over 80 for at least 2 principles. And there's rules like that that are being used to decide which overall level of welfare is given to a certain farm.
Yes.
So welfare quality, they categorized overall welfare into 4 categories. The highest level is excellent welfare, then enhanced welfare, acceptable welfare, and the lowest one is not classified. And they deliberately chose those categories so that every farm could participate in the scheme, in which the highest category of excellent welfare was meant for those type of labels that specifically concern animal welfare as their key issue. The enhanced welfare was more for type of general quality labels in which animal welfare was part of, but not exclusively geared towards an animal welfare label. The acceptable welfare category was meant for those that complied with the minimal welfare standards from legislation, but didn't qualify for the general quality label. And then the 4th category was the lowest, was actually meant for those that actually didn't even meet the legal minimum standards. They also thought that not only every farm could participate with these 4 categories, but there was also sufficient motivation to try to improve and to grade up to the next higher level. And also by having the excellent welfare, there was sufficient scope for marketing the top welfare category. The label probably never was used on commercial food products. The idea was probably something like this, in which the welfare quality logo was printed with then the categorization of the welfare status. But research later on, and especially sensitivity analysis, revealed that even for the welfare quality protocols, there were some problems that seemed hard to justify. And one of the problems that was discovered concerned the method of aggregation, how the weighing of the different indicators contributed to the overall welfare score. Because what the sensitivity analysis discovered is that 2 resource-based welfare indicators predicted the overall categorization with 95% of accuracy. And that meant that those 2 welfare indicators, being drinker space and stocking density, they weighed far too much into the overall qualification, so that the other type of welfare indicators, often perhaps more relevant and even better ones, were hardly necessary or didn't contribute to the overall categorization. If only drinker space and stocking density can predict with 95% accuracy the overall welfare categorization, there's hardly any reason why a trained auditor should still visit a broader farm and conduct the entire welfare quality protocol in order to assess the welfare. It would suffice simply to phone the farmer and get information about drinker space and stocking density, and then the overall welfare categorization could be predicted with high accuracy. And that doesn't seem to make sense. So what I will finish off with is another example of how welfare indicators can be, or how a monitoring protocol can be developed in which the aggregation of different welfare indicators is a key issue. And the example I want to talk about is about a monitoring tool that we developed to assess the pre-slaughter welfare of broiler chickens. And the goal, so I should give you some framework and some context that sets the requirements of the tool that we wanted to develop. So the goal of the tool was a user-friendly protocol to monitor chicken welfare during pre-slaughter phase in practice. It should allow to quantify the main welfare problems during the pre-slaughter phase. It should allow also to identify risk factors, and it should be able to use the protocol for benchmarking, to benchmark catching teams, transport companies, slaughterhouses. And it should also allow to document trends, for example, evolution of time. Does the pre-slaughter welfare improve or deteriorate with time? And what is the impact of possible actions or policies that concern that stage? Important was also that it included an integration to one overall welfare score for the entire pre-slaughter stage, that the measurements were only conducted at the slaughterhouse, and that the protocol was time and cost efficient. And if there were subjective decisions part of the weighing, then it should be based on expert opinion. And then the pre-slaughter stage was defined as starting with the preparations for catching, including the catching and the loading, the road transport, up to the lairage at the slaughter plant before slaughter. So this was defined as the pre-slaughter stage. So we started with first a literature search and also using and assembling the expertise that was available in our own research group to select all possible indicators that we thought could be relevant in the context of monitoring pre-slaughter broiler chicken welfare. And on the basis of that, we identified 16 possible welfare indicators that gave information about different aspects of the pre-slaughter phase, going from the physical condition of the animals to the thermal stress, the comfort in the crates, and routinely collected data such as death on arrivals or carcass rejections, and also the emotional state of the animal. But having 16 possible indicators would require far too much time. So remember, we wanted the protocol to be time efficient. So we set ourselves a limit of 1 hour. The protocol shouldn't take longer to assess one flock in 1 hour. So we needed to cut down on the number of indicators. And we used several criteria to cut down the number of indicators. The first one is that we did a study on 81 flocks in which these 16 welfare indicators were assessed throughout the pre-slaughter stage. And we discovered that there were three indicators on our list that weren't affected by the pre-slaughter stage, that the prevalence of these welfare problems didn't increase during pre-slaughter. And so for us, we use that as a reason to delete these three welfare indicators that are indicated here in green. And we use two other reasons or criteria to remove indicators and to slim down the protocol. The first one is that experts didn't consider that indicator as very important for the welfare of broiler chickens during the pre-slaughter stage. And the third one is if there were double indicators, and we mean by that they more or less measure the same welfare problem, then we would remove one of the two, and then we would choose the one that is the most time consuming to remove. How did we do that? Again, we surveyed poultry welfare experts, and we gave them information about the remaining welfare indicators, gave them more information about how they were measured in practice, and we asked these experts first to score how important they considered that indicator for broiler welfare, and secondly, we asked them to score how they considered the methodological strength about how exactly we measured that indicator. And we wanted then the experts to assign a weight to each of these indicators, going from no weight should be given to that indicator to an average weight should be given to the indicator to the highest weight should be given to this indicator. And by asking these two questions before about the importance and the methodological strength, we wanted these experts to not only consider the importance of the indicator, but also how it is measured in practice before they assign the relative weight of that indicator. And here are the scores from these experts on these different welfare indicators about how much relative weight they should give to each of them. And on the basis of that, we decided that the three lowest, we would remove them from the protocol because experts assigned a very low relative weight to these. We also decided to remove body temperature from the protocol because we had a different indicator that also measured thermal discomfort. And this other one, the huddling and the panting score, was given more importance by the experts. And on top of that, it is less time consuming to score than measuring body temperature on a sample of individual birds. So we could delete another 4 welfare indicators. We could delete soiling not of feathers, weight loss, and qualitative behavior analysis because these were giving low scores, low weights by the experts, and we deleted body temperature because it measures more or less the same thing as panting and huddling. A fourth important criterion is what is called the inter-observer reliability. That is because it's important if different auditors would assess pre-slaughter welfare of broiler chickens on the same flock of animals, they should get the same result. So it should be reliable between different types of auditors. So we assessed that on 4 flocks that were all assessed by 8 observers or auditors, of which 1 was not experienced and 7 were experienced. And they all received on top of that half a day of training with pictures, videos, and live birds. For most of the indicators, we received an agreement which was more than satisfactory, of above 67%. But for 2 indicators, we couldn't really estimate the inter-observer reliability simply because the prevalence was too small. So we couldn't calculate a good figure for the inter-observer reliability. And there's also 2 indicators called the DOA, the death on arrivals, and the rejections, which are based on information given by the slaughterhouse. So these are slaughterhouse records. And up to present, indicators like that have never been tested on reliability. So there are 2 options now. We could either delete these 4 welfare indicators for which we don't know the reliability, or we could give them the benefit of the doubt and assume they were sufficiently reliable to incorporate in our protocol. So we decided for the latter. And so our final welfare protocol, or final protocol, consists of 9 welfare indicators, and the original one, if you remember, numbered 16 indicators. So the original protocol took 150 minutes to perform per flock, and now this was reduced to our goal of 1 hour per flock that was needed to assess these 9 welfare indicators. You can still ask the question, with this selection of indicator, do we assess the relevant welfare problems during the pre-slaughter stage? And one could comment or criticize that the focus is primarily on problems that affect the physical condition of the birds or the health, whereas emotional things such as the level of fear or stress or fatigue are less prominent in this protocol. So we could be accused of being a biased definition or a biased idea about the welfare as it is assessed by this protocol. Remember that we also wanted to arrive or to calculate one integrated overall welfare score during the pre-slaughtered. So we needed to somehow integrate these information from these 9 welfare indicators into an integrated welfare score. And in order to do so, we used this mathematical equation, which consists of 3 steps. And each of these 3 steps require some subjective decisions. And so, again, we decided to use the opinion of experts in order to address these subject decisions. So the 3 steps that need to be done is, for each of the welfare indicators, the actual prevalence needs to convert it to a common scale for all 9 welfare indicators. And that is called the measure score. And that is a score that reflects how acceptable a certain prevalence for a welfare problem is for chicken welfare on a 0 to 100 scale. Another thing that needs to be calculated is the relative weight of each of these welfare indicators. And then it's something called the compensation reduction factor. And the compensation reduction factor addresses the question whether it is fair that if an animal, if a bird during pre-slaughter suffers from a specific welfare problem during that time, whether its overall welfare can still be okay and good because it scores good or average on the 8 other welfare indicators. Often people think, or that the intuitive feeling of a lot of people is that if there is a serious welfare problem, even on one aspect of welfare, the overall welfare cannot be good. And that means that bad scores, and very bad scores in particular, should weigh more in the overall assessment of welfare than average or neutral scores. And if that is the case, we have to compensate, and then we need to include in the definition what is called a compensation reduction factor. Let me first explain this first step and why that is necessary. For the different welfare indicators that are in our protocol, the true prevalence, they range very differently. For example, for thermal stress, the maximal prevalence that we scored in the flocks that we assessed was close to 30% of the animals showing signs of thermal stress, whereas the prevalence of supine birds was much lower, with the maximum of only 3 animals out of 1,000. So the question is it unfair to say that thermal stress is 100 times worse than 0.3% of birds being supine? And that probably is not correct. So what we asked the experts to do is we presented them with our data on the prevalence of all the flocks that we had assessed in our study, and we selected 6 focal flocks and asked the experts to assign a welfare score between 0 and 100 to each of these 6 focal transports. And they were asked to say how acceptable they considered the prevalence for broiler welfare. And we used then the median scores of these experts to calculate relations like this, to see how the true prevalence related to the measure score between 0 and 100 according to the experts. And then for each of the indicator, we drew these associations, and we looked for the best fitting curve to best describe the relationship between the true prevalence and the measure score. And so the types of equation of best fitting curves could differ between the different types of welfare indicators in the protocol. And so these are the formula for the best fitting curves. So this is how we included the first step. The second step is to determine the relative weights of each indicator. Again, we use these experts to do that, and we simply ask them to allocate relative weights to the different indicators. And what you see here is the median rank of the opinion of the various poultry experts, which means, for example, that rejections was the rank, had the lowest rank. That means that the rejections only weigh for 4.2% in the integrated welfare score, whereas the highest rank was dead on arrival, and they determined 17.2% of the integrated welfare score. And now we arrive at the last step, the compensation reduction factor. So we first needed to check whether, according to the experts, there was a need to compensate for to reduce the possibility for compensation. So how did we do that? We presented the experts with information from fictitious flocks with 8 neutral scores for 8 out of the 9 welfare indicators, and then for one indicator we gave an extremely high or an extremely low score. If there was no need for compensation reduction, the overall welfare score would be the arithmetic mean of these 9 scores, so we'd be close to the level of 50 and slightly above in the case of the one extreme positive one, or slightly lower than the 50 for in case of an extreme poor score. However, if according to the experts there was a need for compensation reduction, it would mean that the experts, their score they would give to the black example would be much lower than the arithmetic mean, because they considered if the DOAs are so bad, are so high, then overall welfare of that flock must have been bad. And that is exactly what we saw. According to the experts that we consulted, overall welfare was much more highly influenced by extremely bad scores than it was by neutral or average scores. And so we needed to insert what is called a compensation reduction weight, which gives more weight for indicators with the lowest score. So this is now the formula that we used, and we had data from 53 chicken transports in Belgium. And an important goal also of our tool was that it would differentiate in the welfare status during pre-slaughter on commercial flocks transports. And so you see in this histogram, in this graph, that indeed using this formula you get a nice spread of values for allowing you to differentiate the welfare status during pre-slaughter of different flocks. And the mean score out of a scale from 0 to 100 was close to the midpoint, was 46.6 points. And it was a nice spread. So how can we apply this protocol, this monitoring tool? One possibility is to compare slaughterhouses, and here you see data for 5 different broiler chicken slaughterhouses, in which you can see that the score for one of the slaughterhouses tends to be worse than for the others. And you can do the same for transport companies, and you can see that for one transport company the score was quite lower than for other transport companies. And so you can do the same for catching teams. Also, if you would change the method of catching the animals or the method of transporting the animals, you can use that tool to see what the effect is on broiler welfare if you change catching practices. And that is information that the government or the retailers or the ag industry or the broiler industry, I mean, can use in order to have evidence-based governance. If you're interested in this tool, it's freely available on this website. It's available in 3 languages, in English, Dutch, and French. And so what it requires you to fill in the prevalence for each of the welfare indicators. And what the tool then does is it calculates the measure scores, so the scores between 0 and 100. And then it calculates the overall, so the integrated welfare score, in which the lowest scores are giving the highest weight. And so for this example, the integrated welfare score would be 31. Is this a good score or a bad score? Then you can benchmark that to see how it compares to the other data in the data set. And so in that case, a score of 31 is not so good, so it's a rather bad transport in that case.